Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. This is a space where we seek to create and cultivate healthy conversations between those things we geek out on and the philosophical and theological questions that often arise out of our fandoms. Like, what does it mean to be human? What makes a hero? What makes a villain? How do the stories and narratives we geek out on shape how we live in the world? We are your priest to the geeks. We aren't all ordained, but we see ourselves as mediators at the intersection of geek culture and going deeper in our faith. We don't always have to agree, but we do respect each other, and we see everyone as a beloved child of God. Everyone geeks out on something, so come geek out with us and enjoy the show.
You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast. Without the risk of loss, victory has no value. At least that's according to Worf from Star Trek The Next Generation. Today, guys, we're going to be discussing about some disagreements. We need the risk of loss when we think about Starfleet versus the Klingons. That's right, this is one of the Finding the Good episodes. We're going to be looking at the contrast between Starfleet, Klingons, and trying to find the good in the other side. Can't wait for this, part of our annual theme. I am Joshua Noel. I'll be one of your hosts today, here with the one and only retro Herbie, Herbie Ramsey and Andy Walsh. Excited to be here with you guys. Why don't y'all kick us off? What have you been geeking out on lately, Herbie?
Well, recently I've been doing yet another playthrough of Skyrim. I am about done with that. It's soaked up more time than it should for the last couple months.
No, that's a worthwhile. What are you playing on this time? PlayStation, Switch?
Playing on PC.
Ah, nice. All right, Andy, what have you been geeking out on, man?
My family and I really enjoyed the Electric State over the weekend. I think that puts us, I think we might be 4 of 9 or something like that. People who will stick our heads out and say that we enjoyed it. But yeah, we had a good time with some robots and some moral dilemmas.
Oh yeah. That's that Netflix movie.
Yeah,
I was trying to get Will to watch it. I thought that was fantastic. I was so confused why it wasn't getting good ratings. I was like, this was a really good movie.
Do people just not want to like things anymore? Is just that not a thing that we do?
I don't know. For part of it, I was kind of curious if it was just because one of those things where it's making commentary on certain social situations that people are uncomfortable with. So they're like, I don't like it because it makes me uncomfortable. But that's also me thinking the worst in people. So maybe it's not that. But I don't know. I thought it was really good. So I'm going to say that's what I was geeking out on too. Because I did enjoy that over the weekend. It was a fun movie. So I'm going to second Andy's and move on. Guys, if you're on your laptop, please consider rating and reviewing our show on Podchaser or on GoodPod. That's going to help our show gain recognition in search engines such as Google. That helps us a whole lot and doesn't take a whole lot of time. So we do appreciate that. If you're on your phone, not on the laptop, consider rating, reviewing, or commenting on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Same gig, helps algorithms, helps us, takes almost no time. So please consider doing that. We would really appreciate it. We also appreciate our sponsors. You can sponsor the show on Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon. Today we're going to do a shout out to Russell Gentry. We love you, dude. You rock. Thank you for sponsoring our show. And remember, everybody else who's not Russell, if you'd like your own shout out, you too could support our show for $3 a month on one of those platforms, Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon. I mentioned it earlier. This is part of our annual theme. This year, we're doing finding the good in the other. We're talking about like polarization, and that's our theme this year. We're going through it. It's going to be fun. Today is Starfleet versus the Klingons. Going through the Star Trek series, it is known for having this fight come up over and over again, nuanced later on after the original series a little bit, but Star Trek, Klingons, very different cultures. Basically, Starfleet is, hey, we're trying to explore. We're the scientists. We want to bring everyone together to have, beneficial politics for all the planets kind of deal. Sort of. I'm very oversimplifying it. Just roll with it. Klingons are kind of a warrior culture, and they're like, what do you mean peace and unity? What if we just chopped your head off? Not really. Again, oversimplifying it, but we'll get into a little bit more of the nuance here in a little bit, but that's the gist, I guess. For now, though, I want to see if anybody can help me kind of explain a little bit more, dig in a little bit with some of the history when it comes to this conflict. I'm going to throw it to Herbie. Herbie, when it comes to like the Klingons, when it comes to like those original Star Trek movies, when there were bad guys, and there was a war, then there was a treaty. Could you like what happened? Could you explain it a little bit?
So I can't remember the lore exactly in how the two started how the conflict between them started, but you basically had this warrior race of Klingons that were at war for a long time with the Federation, and then they eventually came to a peace treaty, which was more like a tentative peace. You can kind of think of it as something more along the North Korea, South Korea peace of today, where there's still a lot of hostility between the two groups, but they've kind of had a ceasefire. They've got this neutral zone between them that nobody dares go between. And they're basically agreed that we're not at war with each other right now because, well, we'll both die.
Yeah. It was interesting. So the original series and then some of the earlier original movies, there's a lot of those movies. Just roll with me, guys. If I remember right, the Klingons were kind of basically just, this race is the bad guys. And I'm not sure. Maybe Andy knows more of like the behind the scenes history than I do, but it felt kind of like they went, wait a minute. Having an entire race be the bad guys seems like we're encouraging racism. So maybe we should nuance this a little bit. It kind of feels like retroactively they looked back on it and went, wait a minute, this is problematic. So then they tried to make like a peace treaty thing happen, even though they were all just villains at one point, because I was like, that's not really in the heart of what Starfleet's about. So we want peace to happen, but then we still need this MacGuffin of like bad guys who are strong. So now it's like there's peace, but you don't go to that neutral zone. And then, of course, everyone ends up stuck in the neutral zone for some reason. And then fights persist because, well, we still want to have those fights. We just want to seem like it's not as black and white as it was previously. Andy, anything to add when it comes to some of this? Because I feel like I'm still really oversimplifying it.
Here at Systematic Ecology, we believe in a few things. We believe that there is freedom in Christ to like what you like. We believe that Christian nationalism is a heresy. And probably most important that I'm going to talk about today, at least, is that we believe the best place to spend your extra cash is on the Systematic Ecology merch store. That's right. This is a shameless shill for our own products. We go through Creator Spring, and we have a few great products on there. Me personally, I'm a big like black shirt kind of guy, muted colors. But there's nothing better to like throw a little some extra on there with like a black baseball cap, the dad hat with the Systematic Ecology logo on it. That's a classic. I just really think if you got a couple, $30 extra, that's for us.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to what the behind the scenes rationale was. Certainly as a viewer, it felt like, the Klingons were, the Klingon Federation kind of interaction standoff was something of a Cold War metaphor, among other things, right? I mean, and it's not a perfect one-to-one mapping, but there were definitely elements of that. And certainly as the movies went on, there was some of that. And then, with the thawing of U.S.-Soviet relations and the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? To me, that was what Star Trek VI was about. And so I don't know if there was also an element of recognizing the racial problematic element of it. And I'm not totally convinced that that's an aspect, right? Because you just trade the Klingons for, other alien races who become uniformly villainous subsequently. But so it read to me at the time as more of a, the Soviet Union is falling, the Cold War is ending, and so let's have that reflected in Star Trek as well. And so, my recollection is this Klingon homeworld or a major population center of the Klingon Empire is blown up, and that puts them in, that kind of creates an existential crisis for the Klingons and puts them on a footing where now they have to contemplate some kind of negotiation with the Federation, because they can't go on otherwise. Their numbers have been reduced, their resources have been reduced. But I'm not totally convinced that I'm on the same page, because I'm not remembering the neutral zone as a thing with the Klingons. I remember that as a thing with the Romulans, but I'm not remembering much about a neutral zone with the Klingons. So I'm not totally sure that I'm remembering all the right bits.
I think you might be right on that. I somewhat remember having it there at one time, but it may be where I'm confusing the thing with the Romulans, which is a totally different game. But they definitely had like that hard border set.
Sure, there was definitely a line of this is Klingon territory, this is Federation territory. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like they both have a neutral zone, according to Wikipedia. So take that for what you will. What's interesting, though, not to make you the old man in the room, Andy, but I think it's like Herbie and I have only watched these like retrospect. Neither of us were alive when they were coming out, especially with like the Cold War stuff. Well, actually, I think we might have been alive for some of the newer,
some of the later movies. I
seasons,
kind of was there for it, but I did kind of come to age with the early Next Generation. So yeah, so that's like I would have never had any context for like the Cold War stuff. That makes a lot of sense though, because you can kind of see similarities between like how they're representing Klingon and how like we thought of Russians of like these tough like, oh yeah, meat and beer. And one of the things that's interesting too, all throughout Star Trek, not just the original series, well, especially after the treaty, I'll say especially after the treaty, sometimes it's not just Klingons are bad, now we're going to fight them because we were in a neutral zone or we were in some weird space that they didn't want us to be at or something. Every now and then you have these conundrums, because Starfleet, one of their things is like respecting people's culture and incorporating people on their own terms, basically, which is what I argue the church should do. But then you have this like difficulty with the Klingons, because it's like, how do you bring in a culture of war when you're trying to create peace with everyone? Because like you can't bring them in on their terms, because on their terms means we're going to be killing things, which brings a lot of nuance and complications throughout the series. One of the best examples you see throughout the character of Worf, and all throughout, you mentioned Next Gen. I can never get through Next Gen for some reason. It's just hard for me. But he also ends up joining the one that I really do like, that my brain, Deep Space Nine. There it is. He also ends up joining Deep Space Nine, and I loved him in that one as well. Andy, I'll let you start. Do you want to break down some of like Worf and some of these complications we see when it comes to like trying to respect Klingon culture, even though their values don't necessarily line up with Starfleet?
Sure. Yeah. So Star Trek: The Next Generation begins, and we've got a Klingon on the bridge of the Enterprise, right? Which is quite a radical departure from certainly the original series. And I think it was intentionally a bit provocative, a bit, like what if scenario. What if the Klingons were could be part of the Federation? Over the course of his time on Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, there would be those occasional episodes where some element of Klingon honor culture would come up, or he'd have some dispute with other Klingons or other people on the Enterprise. And from his perspective, the way to resolve that was with some kind of ritual combat or, fight to the death or something like that. There were different elements of the Klingon culture that would come in. And so, it would bring up these questions of how does Starfleet honor that? How does Starfleet respect this other culture when there are some core values that just don't seem to align with the overall Federation mission of, resolving things peacefully and, being non-aggressive and all that kind of thing. I wish I could remember exact episode titles or things like that. It's been a while since I watched any of the Next Generation stuff that extensively. But I do remember those being some engaging episodes and creating some interesting ethical dilemmas of what when you have values in conflict, which values went out.
With Worf, it also is important to recognize that he was Klingon, but he was also trying to reclaim his Klingon heritage because he grew up in the Federation. And that led him to take a very idealized viewpoint of his native culture, which often clashed even with his native culture, where he's like, this is how you're supposed to act. And the Klingons are like, yeah, but yeah. And it's like, even then he's struggling because like he doesn't fit in here. He doesn't exactly fit in there. He's stuck somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And, you know, I really try not to like shoehorn church issues into these episodes and let them like speak for themselves. But it's hard for me with Starfleet because so much of it aligns so well that I'm like, oh, man, because I do think of a lot of conversations I hear in certain church circles now where like people from certain cultures almost feel out of place in our worship areas because like we haven't developed a place that makes it easy for certain people who grow up certain ways to be their true selves in the church environment. You know, I remember this. I've had several conversations of friends of mine who are black who are like, yeah, the Christianity is a white man's religion. And I'm like, well, I don't know what to do with that because like I can't speak to that. I am a white man. So anything I say is just white man thoughts, you know, and it's like, but, you know, I do think we do tend to make things easier for the people who are already there, whether church, workplace, whatever. And then sometimes it's harder for people who want to be brought in to be their true selves in that new environment. And it's really interesting seeing how Worf does try to figure it out because he's like, I want to keep this part of my heritage, but I also believe in these values of Starfleet, and it isn't easy. One of the relationships I really love, though, was Worf and Dax in Deep Space Nine, because Dax is also kind of from a more of an aggressive race, I guess you could say, culture. So they do have their little combats and fights, and it's like he finally has someone who can relate to him and understands the struggle that he's having with Starfleet. We're like, I agree with them, but also sometimes when they're doing these negotiations, I'm like, why don't you just fight that guy? And you're like, yeah, you know what? That does sound easier sometimes. But yeah, Herbie, anything else to add when it comes to Worf and how he plays a role in this tension?
Well, Worf also has another bit of tension in him, in that he is a Starfleet officer, meaning he has already chosen that he is on the side of Starfleet. And that does also come into play because there are times when Starfleet and the Klingons are not at peace. And that leaves him stuck in the middle because he can't betray his own people because that'd be dishonorable, but he can't betray Starfleet because that would be dishonorable. Yeah. And he kind of has to play that. I think there was actually at one point he even has to resign his commission in Starfleet because he can't do what he thinks is right and remain a Starfleet officer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. This is also probably a weird parallel, but it makes me think of some of the stuff that you hear about Barack Obama's time as president, when he was like, there are certain things that he would do and he would hear from the black community of like, wait, that's not what we would, you know, you're going to get your own people. And then there's certain things he would do that he was like speaking the language of his people. And everyone's like, well, you're just being a black president and you're supposed to be just a president. And it's like, no matter what he did, he couldn't win, you know? So it's like, I feel like Worf is put in a very similar situation where it's like, sometimes it's like to be true to his heritage makes him seem like a bad Starfleet officer, and to be a good Starfleet officer makes it seem like he's a bad Klingon. And it's like, oh man, it's not easy.
Then I also remember very vividly another episode where he was talking about growing up, and this was before he was trying, you know, to really explore being a Klingon. He learned that he had to be very restrained. He's, for a Klingon, very reserved. He definitely holds himself back. And he explains it was because when he was a kid, he was playing soccer, and he had headbutted one of his colleagues, one of his fellow teammates. And he didn't understand his own strength, and he had killed the other boy. And at that point, he realized that if he was going to live in the Federation, he had to hold himself back. He had to reserve his actions. He had to hold back his emotions, or else he is going to kill the people he cares about. Yeah.
Oh, man, you know, there's a lot there and a lot to explore. And you see these other themes in other shows like that. Man, moving off of Worf, because this isn't just a Worf episode, although now I'm thinking we should do that at some point. You also see like more of the newer shows. What's interesting is like they're going back to like the older time period in Star Trek, which is still our future, which is kind of confusing. And you almost see a little bit of this like retroactive nuancing of the Klingons during the early wars. Specifically, I'm thinking of like in Strange New Worlds, there's an episode where the one man has PTSD and he remembers one of the Klingons and how he actually murdered all these people and all this stuff that happened. And it turned out that actually he ran away, everyone was dead, and he just ended up taking credit for it. And you're like, oh, so not every Klingon is just all, yeah, let me kill everyone. Some of them do struggle with fear and all these other things. They're not just one thing, you know? And you're like, oh, okay. And it's like, but at the same time, if you've been watching Star Trek for a long time, you realize they're definitely like retroactively trying to nuance this.
If you look at The Undiscovered Country, they did a really strong effort to show that the warrior class was not the only class of Klingons. They had other classes, but the warrior class just took prominence and stayed there because they always found a way to stay at war.
Yeah, I don't remember that reference, but that sounds right. Andy, anything else to add, like either about what we've been talking about there or some of the newer stuff when it dealing with the Klingons and more recent Star Trek?
Yeah, I mean, well, the other character we're talking about, Worf coming from two worlds and the tensions there. The other character that comes to mind is B'Elanna Torres from Voyager, right? Who is not only struggling with being, having Klingon heritage, but being a Starfleet officer, but also, trying to figure out being both half human and half Klingon, and the tensions the cultural tensions that creates for herself and for her interactions with everybody else.
Pardon me if I'm mistaken, but didn't at one point she was struggling with it so much when she was having a child, she was trying to manipulate the DNA of the child so it would have like fewer forehead ridges and stuff like that, because she knew that this child was going to struggle being in a human civilization there on Voyager.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, so dealing with kind of the questions of passing and what if you could choose things for your children to represent different things about different cultures. Yeah.
Sorry. I was trying to remember the name of the, it's like a parody show that Seth MacFarlane did.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember what it was called, but he had a race that was basically parodying the Klingons. And supposedly they were all men, and then one of them got pregnant, and it became a whole thing. So I was like, that, not Klingon, but it is interesting. You kind of see this tension of what does it mean to be a warrior class, and can you have a culture that's only based on warrior, mentality? And I'll argue no. I don't think you can have a culture that is on that, but it does exist in Star Trek for the most part. Their culture is around aggression, war, drinking. Anything else? Whenever, like, if you're explaining just Klingon culture in general, before we pick sides, Andy, could you explain it better?
Well, the other thing we have to remember about Klingon culture is that they gave us Shakespeare, right? So it's not all.
What?
So
I missed this.
So not everyone remembers Star Trek: Undiscovered Country as fondly as perhaps I do, but that was the first Star Trek film I saw in the theaters, and I actually have the replica mug from the dinner scene that's
nice.
Early on in the film, right? So Kirk and Spock and McCoy are invited to this, are hosting or invited to this state dinner with some Klingon dignitaries, one of whom is played by Christopher Plummer, and they're having a conversation about their cultural differences and trying to find some common ground, and but also exposing their prejudices and misunderstandings of each other and so forth. And at one point, one of the Starfleet characters quotes Shakespeare, and one of the Klingons says something to the effect of, you can't really appreciate Shakespeare until you've read him in the original Klingon.
What? That is okay. That's fascinating. All right. Oh man. Okay, so we got Klingons. Herbie, could you better explain what Starfleet is than I did?
Well, Starfleet, it mostly is this federation of planets where people just want to be at peace. So they find a way to govern where everybody has kind of like an equal say. Everybody's going to be respected. There's the idea of basically respecting the individual, but also just having the freedom of self-rule. Like every planet in the Federation of Planets has its own government, and the Federation that kind of binds all of these governments together kind of just deals with the affairs of the coalition as a whole. Also, it's a very idealized future where things like money don't exist. Yeah, so there's the idea that we don't have this scarcity of goods because everything is there for you. And the idea is everybody just does what is what they feel is right because they don't have to fight and struggle with each other to survive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are our sides. We're each going to pick a side, and we're going to explain why we chose the side we did. We can all pick the same side if we want. I think it would be dishonest for me not to pick Starfleet, as much fun as it sounds like it would be to pick Klingon, just to be contrarian. But realistically, you know, I have another podcast, the Whole Church podcast. It's all about like ecumenical work, and like it's basically just the Christian version of Starfleet, you know, all about peace and trying to respect people's culture and bring them together rather than, you know, have us split apart. And then, of course, I much appreciate that passion for exploring and discovering what's out there. Yeah, I'm all for Starfleet. So that's where I'm at. Andy, Starfleet or Klingon, where are you at?
You know, I want to, you know, have some sympathy for the Klingons, and, you know, recognizing the difficulties of, you know, the way that they've been portrayed and some of the issues and the problems that perhaps it raises. And it's, you know, it's hard to have too many beefs with a group that is given, you know, that is given a Shakespeare and Christopher Lloyd and Christopher Plummer, not to mention, you know, the great Michael Dorn that we've already discussed. But we haven't really had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Klingon scientists. Whereas, you know, there are lots of great science characters from Starfleet, you know, and scientific research and exploration is a big part of the Starfleet mission, and, you know, a lot of the storytelling that goes around the Star Trek universe. And so, yeah, again, it's hard to not wind up identifying more with the Federation on those terms.
Yeah. Also, if you're on our Facebook group, please, for the next What If, vote what if there was a Klingon science officer in Starfleet. I want to talk about that now. That sounds fun. Herbie, where are you going, man? Starfleet or Klingon? Or you have 3 for 3 or?
So I really do kind of want to side with the Klingons because there's so much about their culture we don't know. All you know is that part of it that intersects with the Federation, which is going to be their military side. But they are, that being such a dominant part of their culture, and the fact that they tend to expand their empire out of need because they have to continue acquiring people to do a lot of the remedial stuff. Like they're known for marauding the deuterium mines and stuff like that. I can't really side with that because in a long-term situation, I don't see the empire being able to thrive. So I am going to have to go on the side of the Federation. While they have their own weaknesses, they do show that they kind of do have issues when they do have to swap to being militaristic for defense. Mm. In a time of peace, they do have the upper hand on long-term survival.
Yeah. Man, I just gotta say, it would be so hard to fight the Klingons. I think Jesus' way is the best way to fight the Klingons. Because, like, realistically, Starfleet comes up against Klingons, and it's like, they want to fight. And we're like, no, we're all about peace. Oh, you disagree with us? Then let's fight. No, that's not what I said. It's like, what do you do there? And I love, like, just in my mind, like, just imagining Klingon dealing with, like, the whole turn your other cheek. It's like, what do you mean you're not going to fight? I'll turn my other cheek again. Just, you know, a lot of humorous antics playing out in my mind.
I will say, one part that really makes me want to side to the Klingons is you will be dishonored by trying to get ahead using finances as a tool to undo another Klingon family, to the point where you will be disrespected, thrown out of the courts. You have no more standing in their culture if you attempt doing that. We saw that in Deep Space Nine, where Quark basically married a Klingon and then defended her by showing this other guy was using the economy to undo her family.
That's so funny. That's the other thing I guess we didn't really talk much about is like Klingon also is very much of like a honor shame kind of culture. It's based on like how much prestige your family has or you have, and you can do things that bring shame on you and your family. That's a big part of it too. Which is not something I'm a huge fan of. Again, I'm with Starfleet, man. That mutual respect for everybody, something I'm a big fan of.
Hello there, listener. This is Evan Garcia, and I just wanted to jump in here to remind you and to let you know of our Facebook groups and our Discord server. These are great communities where you can post and share memes and talk with the hosts, and we have votes and some polls for future episode topics and fun interactions with our host. So just wanted to remind you that we are focused on community with you listeners, and we love each and every one of you guys listening. Thank you guys.
But the point of the series is to find the good in the other side. So now what we all have to do, starting with Andy, explain why you think, Andy, someone might be on the side of the Klingons, and try to defend that position the best you can.
Sure. So
this is not an easy one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so acknowledge, right, that the universe has been constructed such that they are the antagonists, right? We're not meant to identify them. We're not meant to. We're
not supposed to be doing what we're
root for them. And so we're not given a whole lot of basis on which to do that. You can certainly appeal to the sort of basics of, well, they are sapient beings who want to flourish and want to have their own place in the world and so forth, and so we can find some common ground on that sort of thing, and care for family and all those sorts of things are values that we can recognize that we have in common with the Klingons to some extent or another. Are there times, have we seen times where the Klingons were right about something and the Federation was wrong? I don't have an encyclopedic memory of all the different Star Trek stories. Nothing's coming to mind, which is not to say that it couldn't have happened or that the Federation is infallible. But again, that's not really the storytelling framework that we're working in.
No, it's not.
But I suppose if one possible criticism of the Federation is the tendency towards homogenizing cultures and homogenizing society and kind of subsuming everything. Not to the extent of the Borg necessarily, but there is just sort of a tendency to bring things to the lowest common denominator, or the sort of standing off all the rough edges of various people and cultures to fit into the Federation. And so perhaps that might be a basis on which the Klingons more philosophically might critique them, as eliminating some of the distinctives that make a culture like the Klingons of value to its members or to the people, to the Klingons.
Yeah. All right, Herbie, same task. Explain why you think someone might be on the side of the Klingons and defend that position the best you can.
Well, definitely somebody who comes from a culture that does have either a honor shame or a power weakness type of mentality would probably side with the Klingons, because it would be closer to their worldview, and the idea that if you bring shame to your family, you are in the wrong for bringing in that shame. So that could be a reason why people might identify with that culture. Keep in mind that the Klingon culture did actually derive from parts of humanity. A person who tends to be more aggressive may also side with the Klingons. The people who say that, you have the right to rule via conquest. Somebody who has that type of mentality also might side with the Klingons.
Mm-hmm. All right. I cheated because I gave myself the most time to think about it. Here's what I'm going to go with. I feel as though Starfleet was too quick to dismiss the Klingon. Okay, first off, let me say this is not my actual position or argument. This is me trying to make the argument for the other side. So, Starfleet was too quick to dismiss the Klingon culture because they are so much about peace that they just immediately was dismiss this warlike race. Instead of asking, what they could have done is ask, why does this exist? Clearly the Klingons are thriving, so whatever environment that they came up in, biologically, they evolved to be the dominant species. So it is working for them for some reason. So I think it would have been beneficial, instead of just immediately pushing back, to maybe observe, see, why is this working here? What can we learn from being more aggressive or having some of these attributes, perhaps? And you know, even learning from like shame isn't always a bad thing. Maybe our culture shouldn't revolve around an honor shame system, but we do know evolutionary, you know, kind of speaking, especially like, let me specifically say social evolution. I'll say we see that shame has, you know, helped in certain areas where like we have, let me asterisk, no one here supports fat shaming. However, you can see where a lot of things like that are physically bad for us, shame has played a part in basically peer pressuring people to be healthier, which maybe isn't a great thing, but there might still be something to learn from that dynamic in a society, or some of these other aggressive behaviors that clearly allowed the Klingons to thrive for so long. That's the best I got. I don't know. I feel like all that's still kind of BS, but I tried. Yeah, man, yeah, that's a hard exercise.
All I'm going to say is in one of the first diplomatic missions with the Klingons, Archer totally rejected the Klingon idea of honor and forced the Klingon that had died, that should have died on Earth, to remain alive until he could deliver him alive to Kronos, being told that it was their culture to let the man die honorably.
Well, I will say, like, again, I don't like the idea of honor shame culture being like the basis for how we operate. But like, there are some things like I can see a little bit of a biblical idea behind it, right? Like going into like kind of more of our themes, like what we can pull from this in real life. Because there are some things in the Bible of like, we do honor certain people in the church with like the title elder if they meet certain criteria, or, you know, stuff like that. I think that's beneficial so that you know who to learn from, who to respect. You know, Andy has a doctorate. We honored him with that degree because he did the work to get that degree. And having those honorifics allow us to know who to learn from, who to respect. And I think that's useful. I just don't think our culture should necessarily be based off of it. So I'm going to pull the Starfleet. We respect all people, but I think Klingon has a good point with, hey, sometimes honor is important. Andy, you have any like just general takeaways from like, what are we pulling from all these that's useful in real life? Or is this just three geeks being dumb?
Well, you know, I think the opportunity to engage with the exercise of how do I relate to somebody who's very different from me is always worthwhile. You know, it works better when those people are accurately represented, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, to the extent that Klingons accurately represent any actual, you know, human groups, that can be worthwhile. To the extent that they are parodies or caricatures, or, you know, perpetuate misunderstandings of other groups that we might map them onto, maybe that's not so worthwhile.
Yeah.
But you know, and I think that, you know, learning how to negotiate, right, that not everybody is going to be a part of the Federation. That, you know, that maybe one world system, one universe system, one galaxy system, whatever, may not be the goal to strive for, right? There may be value in having diverse institutions, diverse cultures, diverse organizations interacting with each other and having to engage with each other to mutually improve, as opposed to trying to find, you know, the one size fits all solution that may not actually exist.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Something you said there, I'm going to lean into and then force Herbie to respond to. Though you talked about like just interacting with people who we just can't see their perspective. Like that's why this seems like it's a shorter episode, and we're struggling here because it's like it's just genuinely difficult to see the Klingon perspective. A lot of people where we live in America feel pretty similarly on different sides of the political aisle, or different sides of this issue or that issue, right? Where it's like, how on earth could someone think that's right? You know, like, and it's just beyond us to even understand it. Since that's part of our reality, Herbie, what can we learn from like how Starfleet deals with Klingons who make no sense to them, that maybe we're able to apply in our world when we see people who like, yeah, what you think is right seems so wrong to me that I can't even comprehend it.
Well, to an extent, you don't have to understand how they're thinking or why they think that way. Sometimes you just need to understand that that is how they think. You don't necessarily need to know how the Klingon culture came to be where it is. You do just need to know that this is their culture. This is what they believe. This is how they believe you should act, and engage with that, because you don't necessarily need to know why they are the way they are more than you need to know this is who you're dealing with.
Andy, any other thoughts or follow-ups to that?
Yeah, I mean, you raise an interesting question. I think while there are some similarities, I think there's some pretty big differences in the scenarios that we're dealing with. I would say that the tension between Starfleet and the Klingons is largely one of values. Right? They have very different value systems, and so that means that they prioritize differently and have different goals and so forth. Whereas I think in the current American situation, if you sat down and in the abstract asked people to talk about what they value, what they prioritize, I think a lot of us would list the same things. I think not universally, not in exactly the same order or whatever, yeah. But I think by and large we are talking about the same values. We do want to accomplish the same things. We just have very different understandings of how to accomplish that. In some cases, based on very different understandings of what the reality of the world is that we're living in. And Star Trek has touched on that at different times, issues of propaganda and how do you know what's true, and, how are you getting accurate information out of the, I think even Star Trek 6, has a lot about that. How do we get accurate information out of the Klingon Empire when we're not there on the ground and so forth. But yeah, I think, to stick my neck out a little bit by talking about some particulars, right? We're having a lot of conversations about government efficiency and government waste and fraud and so forth. I think a large portion of Americans would agree that, cutting down on fraud is a good idea, that eliminating waste, if it's true, if we can truly identify what's wasteful, is worthwhile. It's just that we have very different understandings of where our money's actually going and what would constitute fraud and so forth. But I think we can find common ground on, I think if we can identify fraud and waste and inefficiencies, sure, let's figure out a way to improve on those. With the understanding that nothing will ever be 100% efficient, right? Sadie Carnot taught us that a long time ago.
Yeah.
And understanding that, so what the world trade-offs will be. But I'd much rather have a conversation about trade-offs and get down to where there might be subtle differences in our values and why we therefore would accept different trade-offs and have a negotiation on that term than the situation where we seem to be in now, which is just I describe one reality and you describe a different reality, and they're unreconcilable, and we can't really move forward on those terms.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to something else you said, because you kind of did a little bit of a meta-analysis earlier. We're talking about how Klingons were actually kind of a caricature of something that probably doesn't exist in our world. Maybe that's the issue, right? Like what happens in our world is we make this caricature of the other side, right? Like the left sees conservatives as we're all these hillbillies who think Donald Trump's great and we want to kill all brown people or something. And that's not always the case, but we make this caricature and we just assume everyone's that way, and then we can't possibly approach them because that makes no sense to us. And then the other side makes a caricature of the left going, well, they just want to let anybody do whatever they want, and they want anarchy, and they don't care about our border or our safety of our families. And it's well, that's not true either. But we make these characters of both sides, right? And I'm not trying to do the both sidesism. I actually definitely think that the side of Donald Trump is just more wrong. Personally, I will say that. But I can still see that happens in our world where we meet these characters, and then it makes it harder for us to ever talk to one another. And like Andy says, list out these issues that we probably do agree on a lot of the same values. But because of that caricature, we don't even want to come to the table to talk. I don't know. Does that seem
we need to bring the Ferengi into this at this point when you start talking about government spending and but also to bring them in a more direct path. They also have a governmental system that is very different, has very different ideals than the Federation, and yet the Federation seems to be able to work with them a lot better than they did the Klingons.
Yeah, it's crazy how people seem to find ways to work with the people who care about money easier than they do people who have other different value issues. It's interesting. I don't think there's any parallels to that to real life. But Andy, do you have any other final notes before we jump into our wrap up today?
No, I think I've covered it. We've talked about Star Trek 6 plenty.
It was a good movie.
That
If
Andy just wanted to do a Star Trek 6 episode. That's what I learned.
I didn't know that's what was going to happen, but it was relevant.
It is a good movie. If you have not seen Star Trek
true.
6, go watch it. If you have seen it and it's been a while, watch it again.
Yeah, this is our pre-recommendation to the recommendations. We want you to watch Star Trek 6. Yeah. But Herbie, any other final notes before we jump into that wrap up?
No, I think we're good to wrap it up.
Cool. Well, guys, we will be doing a bonus question very quickly. And that's just going to be, what would have happened if the Ferengi backed up the Klingons before their treaty with Starfleet? What if there was Ferengi money on the Klingon side of that war? We'll answer that here in a little bit. But first, we are going to give our recommendations. For me, you know what? The Electric State, good movie. I'm recommending it. I mentioned it earlier. I'm going back to it. I stand by what I said. Andy, any recommendations for the people?
If you like Star Trek Lower Decks, first of all, if you haven't seen any of Star Trek Lower Decks, the cartoon,
I love Lower Decks.
that's a recommendation. But even more niche than that, Ryan North has been writing Star Trek Lower Decks comics. And if you've heard me on almost any other episode of this podcast, I've probably mentioned Ryan North and how I would like to be Ryan North when I grow up. And his Star Trek Lower Decks comics have not dissuaded me of that notion in any way, shape, or form. So check those out.
Well, I know what I'm doing after this. Herbie, recommendations.
I would suggest anybody who has not seen the original series of the feature-length films. So that's like 1 through 7, I think there are 6. If you haven't seen all of them, watch them. Knock it out. It'll take you a week if you do a movie a day.
I really thought there was 8 original movies for some reason.
Nope. Undiscovered Country is the last hurrah for the original crew. Kirk comes back in Generations, which is
Generations.
So it's maybe 6.5.
Yeah, I like
but there are only 6 films with the whole original crew.
Fun stuff. All right. Well, with that, great recommendations. Hope everybody checks out all of them. But if you're on the laptop, here's my other recommendation. Consider rating and reviewing our show on Podchaser or on Good Pods. It's going to help our show gain recognition and make it easier to find in search engines like Google. So we do appreciate you just spending a little bit of time and doing that for us. If you're on your phone, you're not on the laptop, consider rating, reviewing, or commenting on our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's going to help our show be prioritized in those algorithms, which is where most people listen to their podcasts. So that would be cool. Also, we appreciate our financial sponsors from Apple Podcasts, Captivate, and Patreon. Again, thank you, Russell Gentry. You rock. We love you. And if you guys want your own shout out like Russell and to hear me say that I love you, well, you could just call me. I'll say that to basically anyone because I love everybody. But remember, if you want your own shout out, you can support our show for $3 a month on one of those 3 platforms, Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon. Thank you guys so much. Again, if you want to hear more of this series, this is part of our annual theme, Finding the Good in the Other. So the link down below in the show notes will have the entire series down there. And remember, we're all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
Hey, podcast fam, want to stay even more connected with the show? We've got you covered. Check us out on Instagram and Blue Sky, where we're posting exclusive content and bonus videos and fun updates that you won't get anywhere else. From sneak previews of upcoming episodes to bonus content, our social accounts are the best way to keep the conversation going. Plus, it's a great spot for you to interact with other listeners and share your thoughts. We love hearing from you. When you follow us, it helps us grow and continue bringing you the content that you love. Whether it's a funny poll, a quick clip from today's episodes, or just random thoughts, you'll feel more plugged into everything we're doing. So go ahead and hit that follow button on Instagram and Blue Sky. It's one more way to be a part of the show and keep the good vibes flowing. Thanks for being a part of the family, and we can't wait to see you there.
Hello, Systematic Geekology listeners. This is Kevin here. Just want to give a brief ad for some of the other podcasts in our Anazao podcast network. First of all, off is Let Nothing Move You by Christian Ashley, in which Christian goes through the Bible one chapter at a time and gives his thoughts there. There is also the Bible After Hours, which is a more progressive take on the Bible that tries to challenge the status quo with satire and looks at theology. The host uses the pseudonym The Foul-Mouthed Preacher. And as a bonus, Joshua Noel does the voices for this one. So definitely check that one out. And also, and we'll laugh about that later, is the newest podcast that our own Will Rose is starting, where he will interview friends about a story they had that wasn't funny at the time, but that they laugh about now. So definitely check out these shows and subscribe to us wherever you get your pods. Thank you very much.